I never asked for a war. In fact, if there's one thing I've built my life around, it's the principle of avoiding unnecessary conflict. I run a small, successful custom cabinetry business. It's quiet work, precise work. You measure twice, you cut once, and you don't waste energy on things that don't matter. I liked my quiet apartment, my predictable schedule, and the simple satisfaction of a job well done. All of that changed with a phone call, an inheritance, and a 30-year-old conflict I knew almost nothing about. My Uncle Robert was what you might call a character. He was a retired civil engineer, a man who believed the world should operate on logic, physics, and a healthy dose of stubbornness. He'd lived in the same house in the Whispering Pines subdivision for 40 years. It was a nice place, or at least it had been when my aunt was alive. Tree-lined streets, decent-sized lots, the kind of suburban dream that was popular in the late 70s. After she passed, Uncle Robert became more eccentric. He wasn't unfriendly, but he had a bone-deep opposition to anyone telling him what to do, especially when it came to his own property. When the lawyer called to tell me Uncle Robert had passed away peacefully in his sleep, the sadness was mixed with a strange sense of foreboding. He had no children, and I was his closest living relative. The house, his savings, everything was left to me. The lawyer, a tired-looking man named Mr. Davies, handed me the keys and a heavy cardboard box. "Your uncle was a meticulous record keeper," he said, a faint, weary smile on his face. "This is his personal file." He called it the war chest. I didn't understand the significance of that name until I started the process of moving into the house. Whispering Pines was governed by a homeowners association, a concept I was only vaguely familiar with. In my uncle's early years there, the board was apparently a benign entity that organized a yearly barbecue and made sure the grass in the common areas was mowed. It was a formality, a mechanism for basic upkeep. But according to the first few folders in the war chest, that had changed dramatically about 5 years ago. A new resident had moved in. Her name was Brenda Holloway. According to my uncle's spidery, annotated notes, Brenda was a woman who had found her life's calling in the petty tyrannies of neighborhood governance. She had a husband who seemed to perpetually travel for work and no discernible hobbies outside of measuring the length of her neighbors' lawns with a tape measure. She joined the board within 6 months of moving in, and through a campaign of attrition, relentless procedural nagging, and the sheer exhaustion of the other members, she was elected president a year later. Her reign began subtly. First, it was a new rule about mailboxes. All mailboxes had to be a specific model, black, with brass numbers of a particular font. A dozen homeowners had to replace perfectly good mailboxes. Then came the approved color palette for front doors. Then a regulation on the maximum height of decorative shrubbery. Each new rule was minor, annoying, but not quite worth fighting a war over for most people. They grumbled, they complied, and they went back to their lives. But not my Uncle Robert. For him, each new regulation was a personal affront, an illogical intrusion into his domain. His files were filled with copies of letters, written in a tone of cold, engineering precision, dissecting the absurdity of each new bylaw. I spent the first 2 weeks at the house just cleaning. It was cluttered but not dirty. Decades of a life lived were packed into every room. As I worked, I felt like I was getting to know my uncle better than I ever had. I found his old slide rule, his collection of naval history books, and in the garden shed, tucked behind a bag of potting soil, I found the primary casus belli of his later years, a 2-foot-tall garden gnome, cheerfully painted, holding a tiny fishing rod. His name, according to a faded label on the bottom, was General Sherman. My first direct encounter with the enemy occurred on a Saturday morning. I was on a ladder, cleaning out the gutters, when a sharp, commanding voice cut through the quiet air. "Excuse me. You there?" On the ladder I looked down to see a woman standing on the sidewalk. She was in her mid-50s, dressed in crisp athletic wear that looked like it had never seen a bead of sweat. She had a tightly permed helmet of blonde hair, a clipboard in her hand, and an expression that suggested she had just smelled something unpleasant. This had to be Brenda Holloway. "Good morning," I said, trying for a neutral, neighborly tone. "I am Brenda Holloway, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, she announced, as if presenting her credentials to a foreign diplomat. "I don't believe we've been introduced. You are the new resident of this property." "I'm Mark." "Robert was my uncle," I explained. "I inherited the house." "I see," she said, her eyes scanning the property, cataloguing every perceived flaw. Her gaze landed on the flowerbed near the porch, where I'd placed General Sherman after cleaning him up. Her lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. "I'm afraid we have a problem." That object, she pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the gnome. "It is in direct violation of Bylaw 17, Section C, subsection 4, which expressly prohibits decorative statuary of a whimsical or folkloric nature." I almost laughed. It sounded like something from a comedy sketch. "It's a garden gnome," I said. "It was my uncle's." "Your uncle was well aware of the rule," she snapped, her voice losing its feigned civility. "He was issued no fewer than 14 written warnings and was accruing fines for that specific violation at the time of his passing. As the new owner, you are now responsible for bringing the property into compliance. You have 48 hours to remove it, or the fining process will resume." I stared down at her from the ladder, a mix of disbelief and annoyance bubbling up inside me. I wasn't a fighter. I was a woodworker. I just wanted to settle into my new home, sort through my uncle's belongings, and be left alone. But the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of this woman, standing on a public sidewalk and issuing decrees about a ceramic gnome, struck a nerve. It was the same nerve my uncle had, I suppose. The one that twitched at the sight of unreasonable authority. "With all due respect, Mr. Mark," she said, stumbling on my name as if it were an inconvenience, "I have a lot on my plate right now. The gnome isn't hurting anyone. It can wait." "The rules do not wait," she declared, making a sharp tick mark on her clipboard. "The rules maintain our community standards and protect our property values." 48 hours she turned on her heel and marched off down the street, a one-woman army of suburban order. I watched her go, then looked at the cheerful, oblivious gnome. The war, it seemed, was part of the inheritance. I chose to ignore her. It seemed like the most reasonable course of action. I had a house to empty, a business to run, and a life to live. A garden gnome was so far down my list of priorities it was practically in the Earth's core. For 2 days, there was nothing. I hoped, that maybe she had bigger fish to fry. Perhaps someone had planted a non-approved species of rosebush or hung their laundry out to dry on a Sunday. I underestimated her tenacity. On the 3rd day, a crisp white envelope was taped to my front door. It was an official notice from the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. It cited Bylaw 17, Section C, subsection 4, and informed me that a fine of $50 had been levied against my property for failure to comply. It stated that the fine would double for every 7-day period the violation remained uncorrected. I sighed, tossed the letter onto the growing pile of mail on the kitchen counter, and went back to work. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one was delivered via certified mail, requiring my signature. The fine was now $100. The letter also included a new list of violations. The trim on my front window was, apparently, a shade of eggshell white inconsistent with the approved whisper whites on the community palette. Furthermore, a small satellite dish on the roof, which had been there for at least a decade, was visible from the street, in violation of Bylaw 22, Section A. This was no longer just about a gnome. This was a campaign. Brenda Holloway wasn't just enforcing rules, she was targeting me. She was continuing her war with my deceased uncle, and I was the new proxy. That evening, I finally sat down and opened the war chest. It was a revelation. My uncle hadn't just been a cranky old man writing angry letters. He had been a methodical, diligent researcher. He had copies of the association's annual budgets for the last 10 years, minutes from every meeting, and detailed notes on every single homeowner. He had highlighted sections of the bylaws and cross-referenced them with state and local ordinances. One file in particular caught my eye. It was labeled the Henderson Alliance. Inside were notes on conversations with another longtime resident, a man named George Henderson. He lived 3 doors down. My uncle described him as a decent man, retired Army, understands strategy. The next morning, I saw an older gentleman out walking his beagle. He had a military bearing and a kind face. I took a chance. "Mr. Henderson?" I called out. He stopped and turned. "That's me." I knew must be Robert's nephew. "Mark, is it? Welcome to the neighborhood. Sorry about your uncle. He was a good man. A pain in the neck, but a good man." I smiled. "That sounds about right. I was hoping I could talk to you for a minute. I've been formally introduced to Brenda Holloway." George Henderson's face clouded over. He let out a low whistle. "Ah. The welcoming committee. Let me guess. The gnome." "Among other things," I said, holding up the latest notice. "Come on inside," he said, gesturing toward his immaculate little house. "We've got a lot to talk about." For the next hour, George filled me in on the reality of life in Whispering Pines under President Holloway. He told me how she used the fines as a revenue stream and a tool for intimidation. People who crossed her found their property scrutinized for every possible infraction. People who were her friends could get away with anything. He told me about Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow at the end of the street. Brenda was fining her $200 a month because her bird feeders were attracting squirrels, which Brenda had unilaterally declared a nuisance animals. Mrs. Gable was on a fixed income and was terrified of losing her home. "Most people are too scared or too busy to fight," George explained, his voice grim. "They just pay the fines to make her go away." Robert was the only one who consistently stood up to her. He knew the bylaws better than she did. He'd tie her up in procedural knots. Now that he's gone, she thinks she has free rein. "She's putting a lien on my house," I said quietly. A new letter had arrived that morning, threatening exactly that if the cumulative fines, now totaling several $100s, were not paid within 30 days. George's expression hardened. "She's done that before. To the Millers, 2 streets over. They had a medical emergency and their lawn got a little long. She put a lien on their house for $150 in fines. They had to pay her and her lawyer's fees to get it removed. It's extortion, plain and simple." The conversation was a turning point. This wasn't a silly dispute anymore. It was affecting vulnerable people. It was fundamentally wrong. My uncle's war had been one of principle, but it had now become a matter of justice. "What can we do?" I asked. "She controls the board. She seems to have all the power." Robert had a theory, George said, leaning forward. He always said, follow the money. He was convinced she was skimming, but he could never find the proof. "The budgets are opaque. The expenses for landscaping and common area maintenance have tripled since she took over, but the service hasn't gotten any better. In fact, it's worse." That night, I went back to the war chest, this time with a specific goal. I spread the last 5 years of annual budgets across my uncle's old dining room table. Just as George had said, the numbers were staggering. The line item for grounds and water management was astronomical. It had ballooned from a modest $10,000 a year to over $50,000. The vendor listed for this service was a company I'd never heard of, Aquaprime Solutions. My uncle had circled the name several times and written a question mark next to it. He'd tried to look them up, but his notes indicated he'd hit a dead end. But my uncle didn't have the same tools I did. I pulled out my laptop and started digging. Aquaprime Solutions had a bare-bones website, full of stock photos and vague corporate jargon. It listed a post office box as its address. Using the state's online business registry, I looked up its corporate filings. The company was a limited liability company, formed just 4 years ago. The registered agent and sole officer was a man named Martin Holloway. It took me another 10 minutes of searching on social media to confirm it. Martin Holloway was Brenda's brother-in-law. It was blatant nepotism, a clear conflict of interest. But that wasn't a smoking gun. It was shady, but not necessarily illegal, depending on the association's bylaws regarding contracts. I needed more. What service was Aquaprime actually providing for $50,000 a year? The community had a small park, a retention pond, and some grassy common areas. They were irrigated by a sprinkler system. I walked the perimeter of the common areas the next day, looking at the sprinkler heads. They were old, commercial-grade models. I checked the water meter for the common area, located near the main entrance. The dial was caked with dust and cobwebs. It didn't look like it had moved in years. So where was the water coming from? I pulled up the original subdivision plans from the county assessor's website. My uncle, bless his meticulous soul, had a copy in his files as well. The plan showed the entire irrigation system was supposed to be fed by the municipal water supply, through that very meter I had just checked. If the meter wasn't running, the sprinklers shouldn't be working. But they were. I'd seen them running myself just a few mornings ago. George Henderson and I spent the next Saturday walking the property line behind the retention pond, an area that was overgrown and neglected. Robert always said this part of the property was weird, George commented, swatting away a mosquito. The survey markers never seemed to line up right. We pushed through a thicket of overgrown bushes and found it. Tucked into a small clearing was a concrete slab with a heavy-duty well cap and an electrical control box. It was a well. An industrial-grade well, complete with a powerful pump. There was no record of this well on any of the official plans. A quick search of the county permit database showed no permits ever issued for drilling a well on that parcel of land. It was an illegal, unpermitted, and, most importantly, an untested water source. Brenda Holloway wasn't just paying her brother-in-law to mow the lawn. She was paying him a fortune to operate an illegal well, supplying non-potable, untested water to the community's irrigation system and likely pocketing a significant portion of its maintenance fees. This was the secret. This was the leverage. It was bigger and more dangerous than I could have imagined. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was a massive liability and a potential health hazard. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I consulted with Mr. Davies, the lawyer. I laid out everything I had found, the inflated contracts, the shell company run by Brenda's relative, the unused water meter, the photos of the hidden, unpermitted well. He looked over the documents, his weary expression slowly replaced by one of intense focus. "Mark," he said, looking up from the county plat map, "this is more than just a bylaw dispute. This is fraud. This is conspiracy. The liability here is astronomical. If that well water is contaminated and it's being sprayed all over the common areas where children play, the entire association, meaning every single homeowner, could be sued into oblivion." He explained the strategy. We couldn't just go to the board. Brenda controlled the board. We had to go to the homeowners directly. The annual association meeting was in 3 weeks. It was the one time all year that the homeowners had a legal forum to voice their concerns. Brenda usually rushed through these meetings, relying on the apathy of the residents to pass her budget and re-elect her cronies. This year, we were going to make sure it was different. "She's already put the lien on your property on the agenda," Mr. Davies noted. "She intends to make an example of you. We're going to let her. She'll spring her trap, and then we'll spring ours." For the next 3 weeks, George Henderson and I became reluctant activists. We went door to door. We didn't talk about the well, not yet. We saved that for the meeting. Instead, we talked about the fines, the arbitrary rules, and the lack of transparency. We showed them the budget with its absurd $50,000 line item for landscaping. We talked to Mrs. Gable, who, with our encouragement, agreed to tell her story. We collected proxies from people who couldn't attend. By the time the night of the meeting arrived, we knew we wouldn't be facing Brenda alone. The community room at the local library, which was usually half empty for these meetings, was packed. There were people standing in the back. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her 2 loyal board members, a nervous-looking accountant and a woman who seemed to be surgically attached to her phone. Brenda beamed at the large turnout, misinterpreting it as a sign of her own popularity and the community's engagement. She had no idea she was staring at a firing squad. The meeting droned on with procedural nonsense. Brenda was smug and condescending, swatting away questions with practiced ease. Finally, she arrived at the main event. Next on the agenda, she announced, a cruel smile playing on her lips, is the matter of the property at 12 Oak Street, currently owned by Mr. Mark Jensen. This property is in significant violation of numerous community bylaws and has accrued over $2,000 in unpaid fines. The board has placed a lien on the property and now moves to authorize our legal counsel to begin foreclosure proceedings to recover the debt. A shocked murmur went through the crowd. This was her show of force, her public execution. Mr. Jensen, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, do you have anything to say before the board votes? This was our moment. I stood up. I do, I said, my voice steady. But first, I'd like to yield my time to my legal counsel, Mr. Davies, who has a presentation for the board and for all the homeowners here tonight. Brenda's smile faltered. She hadn't expected me to have a lawyer present. Mr. Davies walked to the front of the room and set up a projector. Good evening, he began, his voice calm and professional. My name is Alan Davies. I'm here representing Mr. Jensen. But what I have to discuss tonight concerns every single homeowner in Whispering Pines. He began by putting the association's budget on the screen. He pointed to the $50,000 line item for grounds and water management. I'm sure you're all curious as to what this money is being spent on, he said. He then put up the corporate filing for Aquaprime Solutions, showing Martin Holloway's name. A picture of Martin and Brenda Holloway from a family barbecue, downloaded from social media, appeared next to it. The crowd began to whisper. Now, a $50,000 contract for landscaping and water might seem high, but perhaps not unreasonable, Mr. Davies continued, if it were for a legitimate service. However, we have a problem. He put a picture of the dusty, motionless community water meter on the screen. According to municipal records, this meter, which is the only legal source of water for the common areas, has registered zero usage for the past 4 years. The room fell silent. Brenda's face had gone pale. So the question is, Mr. Davies said, his voice dropping for dramatic effect, where is the water coming from? He clicked to the next slide. It was a crystal clear, high-resolution aerial photograph of the common area behind the pond. A red circle was drawn around the clearing in the bushes. The next picture was a close-up of the wellhead. It's coming from here, he said. An unpermitted, unregistered, and, most importantly, untested private well, drilled on common property in violation of county, state, and federal regulations. The room erupted. People were shouting questions. Brenda was stammering, trying to bang her gavel. This is out of order. This is slander. Mr. Davies ignored her. He put up his final slide. It was a lab report. Because of the potential health risks to the community, my client paid to have a sample of the well water tested. The report came back yesterday. He highlighted a section. The water contained significant levels of E. coli and unsafe concentrations of nitrate from agricultural runoff. For the past 4 years, our children have been playing on grass that has been irrigated with contaminated water. That was it. The dam broke. The rage in the room was palpable. People were on their feet, shouting at Brenda. Her 2 board members looked like they wanted to crawl under the table. Brenda, cornered and exposed, did the only thing she could. She shrieked, "This meeting is adjourned," and tried to flee the room. But it was too late. As if on cue, 2 uniformed county sheriff's deputies and a woman in a suit holding a badge from the district attorney's office entered the room. They had been waiting in the hallway. Mr. Davies had called them that afternoon. They intercepted Brenda before she could reach the door. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The district attorney's investigation uncovered a complex scheme of embezzlement and fraud. Brenda and her brother-in-law had set up Aquaprime Solutions to funnel association dues directly into their own pockets. The maintenance they were performing on the illegal well was a complete sham. They had built the homeowners of Whispering Pines out of nearly $200,000 over 4 years. Brenda Holloway was charged with multiple felonies, including grand larceny, conspiracy to commit fraud, and reckless endangerment due to the contaminated water. Her loyal board members, facing charges of their own, testified against her in exchange for lesser sentences. The trial was short. The evidence was overwhelming. Brenda was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 5 to 7 years in state prison. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the Homeowners Association. Her husband filed for divorce before the sentencing was even over. Her carefully constructed kingdom of petty rules and regulations had crumbled into ruin. With the old board dissolved by court order, an emergency election was held. George Henderson was unanimously elected as the new president. The first official act of the new board was to formally expunge the lien on my property and issue a public apology. They hired a legitimate, bonded company to decommission the illegal well and connect the irrigation system to the city water supply, paid for entirely by the first installment of Brenda's court-ordered restitution. The bylaws were completely overhauled. The new rules were simple, based on common sense and mutual respect rather than control and intimidation. The approved color palette was abolished. The mailbox regulation was rescinded. And a new clause was added, which George Riley called the General Sherman Proviso, explicitly permitting decorative garden statuary. It's been 2 years since that chaotic night. Whispering Pines is a different place. It's a community now, not a fiefdom. Neighbors talk to each other. People help each other with their yards. There's a new playground in the park, and the annual barbecue has been reinstated. Property values, which had stagnated under Brenda's reign of terror, have steadily climbed. It's a genuinely nice place to live. I saw Brenda once after she was released from prison. She had served a little over 3 years. I was leaving the grocery store, and she was collecting shopping carts from the parking lot. She looked tired and much older. The arrogant, commanding presence was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. She saw me, and for a moment, her eyes widened in panic. Then she just looked down at the ground. She pushed a cart past me and mumbled something. It sounded like, "I'm sorry," I just nodded. There was nothing else to say. I didn't feel anger anymore, or even satisfaction. I just felt a quiet sense of pity. She had thrown her life away in pursuit of a pathetic illusion of power. The war was long over, and she was its greatest casualty. My uncle's house is my home now. I finished cleaning it out, but I kept his books and his old slide rule. In my workshop, I built a new mantel for the fireplace, a beautiful piece of dark cherry wood that would have made him proud. I found the quiet life I always wanted, right here in the place I least expected it. And on my front lawn, nestled in the flower bed near the porch, stands a 2-foot-tall garden gnome holding a tiny fishing rod. General Sherman survived the war. He stands there as a quiet reminder that sometimes, you don't go looking for a fight. Sometimes, the fight comes to you. And that the most ridiculous, trivial-seeming things, like a ceramic gnome, can sometimes represent the most important principles of all: the right to be left alone, the freedom to live in your own home without harassment, and the simple, stubborn refusal to bow to a bully. My uncle fought for 30 years on principle. It took me less than a year to finish the job, not just for him, but for an entire community that had forgotten it had a voice. And that, I think, is an inheritance worth fighting for.